The tension in the House chamber was electric as Speaker Mike Johnson stood confidently at the podium, seemingly in control of the contentious debt ceiling debate that had dominated Washington for weeks. The government shutdown deadline loomed just 48 hours away, and Johnson appeared ready to force through his partisan bill with little room for compromise. That's when Representative Jasmine Crockett approached the microphone, carrying what looked like an ordinary folder. What the Speaker didn't know was that this folder contained evidence that would completely upend his strategy and leave the entire chamber speechless. As Johnson prepared to call the vote, Crockett raised a point of order. The Speaker's dismissive glance betrayed his assumption that this was just another delay tactic from the opposition. He had no idea what was about to happen. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her voice steady and measured. "Before we proceed with this vote, I believe the American people deserve to know exactly what this bill contains and what was secretly removed last night." Johnson's expression shifted from confidence to visible concern in an instant. The chamber, typically filled with side conversations and movement, fell completely silent. Within seconds, C-SPAN cameras caught multiple Republican representatives exchanging worried glances, while staffers frantically flipped through documents. What happened next wouldn't just change the outcome of this particular vote. It would fundamentally alter how legislative transparency would be approached for years to come. The look on Johnson's face as Crockett methodically revealed her evidence became one of the most shared political moments of the year, with millions of Americans witnessing a masterclass in legislative accountability unfold in real time. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping political confrontations that reveal the true character of America's most influential figures. Hit the notification bell so you never miss these historic moments as they unfold on the national stage. Mike Johnson, 52, had risen to the position of Speaker of the House following unprecedented party infighting. A former constitutional lawyer and religious conservative from Louisiana, Johnson had built his career on unwavering adherence to traditional values and fiscal conservatism. His ascent to the speakership came after his party had cycled through multiple candidates, eventually settling on Johnson as a compromise figure who could potentially unite the fractured caucus. Despite his relatively low national profile before becoming Speaker, Johnson quickly established himself as a forceful presence in Washington. Known for his methodical speaking style and careful attention to procedural details, he projected an image of calm authority that masked an intensely strategic mind. "The American people elected us to restore fiscal sanity to Washington," Johnson often said in media appearances, positioning himself as the responsible adult in a city of reckless spenders. Behind closed doors, however, Johnson was known as a shrewd political operator who understood how to use House rules and procedures to maximize his party's advantage. The debt ceiling bill represented Johnson's most significant test as Speaker, a chance to demonstrate his ability to deliver a legislative victory while extracting meaningful concessions from the opposing party and the White House. The bill included substantial spending, cuts to social programs while preserving military funding, alongside regulatory rollbacks that his party's donors had long sought. For Johnson, the stakes were immense. Success would solidify his position as Speaker and strengthen his party's negotiating position. Failure could reignite the internal party divisions that had made the speakership such a precarious position in recent years. Standing in opposition to Johnson's strategy was Representative Jasmine Crockett, 43, representing Texas's 30th congressional district. Though only in her second term, Crockett had quickly earned a reputation as one of the most formidable members of Congress due to her exceptional legal mind and unflappable demeanor under pressure. Before entering politics, Crockett had built an impressive career as a civil rights attorney in Texas, handling complex cases that required both legal brilliance and strategic patience. A graduate of Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, she had worked as both a public defender and in private practice, specializing in cases involving voting rights and government accountability. What made Crockett particularly effective was her unique combination of legal precision, deep connection to her constituents, and remarkable ability to remain composed in high-pressure situations. Unlike many politicians who relied primarily on talking points prepared by staff, Crockett brought the evidence-based approach of a successful trial attorney to every debate and confrontation. In a courtroom, you can't just make assertions without evidence, she once explained in an interview. That discipline should apply to Congress as well. The American people deserve representatives who deal in facts, not just rhetoric. Crockett's district encompassed diverse communities in Dallas County, including both urban neighborhoods facing economic challenges and suburban areas with different concerns. This range gave her first-hand insight into how federal policies affected people across demographic and economic spectrums, particularly when it came to government services that would face cuts under Johnson's proposal. The confrontation between these two powerful figures wasn't just about a single bill or vote. It represented a fundamental clash between competing visions of governance. Johnson's approach that prioritized ideology and party unity versus Crockett's insistence on transparency and evidence-based policy. For Johnson, the debt ceiling bill was about securing a political win. For Crockett, it was about exposing what she saw as a process that had abandoned good governance in favor of partisan advantage. As the American people watched this confrontation unfold, the stakes extended far beyond Washington politics. With a potential government shutdown looming, millions of federal employees faced furloughs, government services would be disrupted, and market instability threatened the broader economy. The outcome would affect everyday Americans in immediate and tangible ways, making the showdown between Johnson and Crockett all the more consequential. The House chamber hummed with anticipation as Speaker Johnson moved to bring his debt ceiling bill to a final vote. Behind the scenes, Republican staffers had spent the morning counting votes, confident they had secured the razor-thin majority needed to pass the legislation. Johnson had personally called wavering members the night before, offering committee assignments and project funding to secure their support. What Johnson didn't know was that Crockett had spent the previous night in her office with a small team of legal staff, meticulously comparing two versions of the bill, the publicly available text and a draft that had been accidentally sent to a Democratic staffer by a tired Republican committee aide. The differences between the versions revealed last-minute changes that had not been disclosed to the full House, including the removal of ethics provisions for cryptocurrency regulations and the insertion of a liability shield for certain industrial polluters. As Crockett raised her point of order, Johnson initially responded with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to procedural delays. "The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute," Johnson said, glancing at the clock. The vote was scheduled tightly, with several members needing to leave for fundraising events later that afternoon. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker," Crockett began. "I rise to call attention to serious discrepancies between the bill text that was distributed to members yesterday and the version we are being asked to vote on today." Johnson's expression remained neutral, but those seated near him noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the podium. "The gentlewoman should know that the final version of the bill was properly filed with the clerk," Johnson replied. "If she has procedural concerns, the appropriate venue would be the Rules Committee, not the House floor during a critical vote." Crockett nodded, seemingly accepting the rebuke, but then removed a document from her folder. "I appreciate the Speaker's guidance on procedure," she said, her tone measured but firm. "However, House Rule 13C specifically requires that any substantive change to legislation after committee approval must be explicitly communicated to all members at least 24 hours before a floor vote." Johnson's legislative director, seated just off the floor, began typing frantically on his phone, likely checking the exact rule Crockett had cited. "The chair is well aware of the House rules," Johnson responded, a slight edge creeping into his voice. "The changes were technical in nature, not substantive. We need to proceed with this vote." The C-SPAN cameras caught the reaction of a veteran Republican representative who served on the Rules Committee, a subtle widening of the eyes that suggested Crockett might be onto something. "Significant. With all due respect, Mr. Speaker," Crockett continued, removing more documents from her folder. "I have here the version distributed yesterday to all members, and beside it, the version filed this morning at 3:42 a.m. The differences are not technical." She held up both documents. Section 457, which contained the corporate transparency requirements for companies seeking federal contracts, has been completely removed. Section 612, which previously limited relief funds to businesses with clean environmental records, now contains a retroactive liability shield. A murmur spread across the chamber. Several members began asking their staff for copies of the current bill text, wanting to verify Crockett's claims firsthand. Johnson's face remained composed, but those who knew him well could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing whether to push forward or acknowledge the issue. The changes reflect necessary compromises to secure the votes needed to avert a government shutdown, Johnson said, pivoting to the stakes rather than addressing the procedural question. If the gentlewoman is more concerned with parliamentary procedure than preventing a shutdown that would harm her constituents, perhaps her priorities need examination. The attempted deflection might have worked in previous confrontations, but Crockett had anticipated this line of attack. Mr. Speaker, ensuring proper procedure isn't separate from serving our constituents. It's essential to it. The American people deserve to know what their representatives are voting on. She paused, then added, especially when the changes benefit specific donors who contributed over $3 million to campaigns last quarter. The chamber erupted in reaction, Democratic members audibly responding to the allegation while Republicans called for order. Johnson struck his gavel repeatedly. The gentlewoman will refrain from making unfounded allegations, Johnson said sharply. I'm simply stating public records, Crockett responded calmly, holding up another document. The FEC filings are available for anyone to review. 3 corporations that would directly benefit from the midnight changes are among the top donors to campaigns that support this bill. From the gallery, journalists began rapidly typing on their phones, likely checking the campaign finance claims. A producer for one of the major networks could be seen signaling for a camera to zoom in on the documents Crockett was holding. Johnson, recognizing the dangerous territory the discussion had entered, attempted to regain control. The gentlewoman's time has expired, he announced, moving to recognize another member. Mr. Speaker, I move to postpone consideration of this bill until all members have received the correct text and had 24 hours to review it, as required by our rules, Crockett said quickly, making a formal motion that would require a response. Johnson conferred briefly with the parliamentarian. Their whispered conversation picked up faintly by nearby microphones. The motion is not in order at this time, Johnson finally ruled. We will proceed with the vote. Crockett then executed the move she had prepared for this exact scenario. In that case, Mr. Speaker, I respectfully appeal the ruling of the chair and request a recorded vote on whether House rules require proper notice of substantive changes. This procedural maneuver effectively challenged Johnson's authority to dismiss her concerns without a vote of the full House and would require members to go on record, either supporting or opposing transparency in the legislative process. Johnson's expression darkened. This was no longer a minor delay, but a direct challenge that would force every member to take a public position. Those watching closely noticed beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the chamber's aggressive air conditioning. Very well, Johnson said, after another consultation with the parliamentarian. The question is, shall the decision of the chair stand as the judgment of the House? As members prepared to vote on this procedural question, Republican whips moved quickly through their side of the chamber, instructing members to support the Speaker. But Crockett wasn't finished. Before we vote, Mr. Speaker, members should be aware of one more relevant fact, she said, her voice cutting through the chamber noise. I've just been informed that the Washington Post and New York Times have both received copies of emails between staff members explicitly discussing how these changes should be made quietly and without drawing attention because they wouldn't survive public scrutiny. The chamber fell silent. Whether the emails actually existed or not, the claim created an immediate dilemma for Johnson and his supporters. Voting to proceed without transparency now carried the risk of appearing in tomorrow's headlines as a cover-up. From the gallery, journalists furiously took notes. The Washington Post's congressional correspondent signaled to her photographer to capture images of Crockett's documents. Meanwhile, C-SPAN viewership surged as social media alerts spread about the unexpected drama unfolding on what was supposed to be a routine vote. In the Republican cloakroom just off the House floor, aides frantically checked their phones, trying to determine if the emails Crockett mentioned had actually leaked. One senior staffer turned to another and whispered, "How did she know about the changes?" Those were only discussed in the leadership meeting at midnight. The question hung in the air. Had there been a leak from within their own ranks, or had Crockett's team simply done the detailed comparative analysis that few bothered to undertake with 1,000-page bills? Back on the floor, members who had planned to vote without reading the full bill text now found themselves in an uncomfortable position. A group of moderate Republicans from competitive districts huddled together, visibly concerned about the political implications of appearing to support secretive legislative practices. A senior Republican member approached the speaker's podium and whispered something to Johnson, likely advising him on how to proceed without losing face. The C-SPAN cameras captured Johnson's expression as it shifted from frustration to resignation. "We need to pause," the senior member advised. "This is turning into a transparency issue that will overshadow the actual bill. Better to look deliberate than secretive." The stage was now set for the most dramatic moment of the confrontation, one that would transform a procedural dispute into a viral political moment with lasting consequences for both Crockett and Johnson, as well as for how Congress conducted its business in full view of the American people. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, her voice clear and steady in the now silent chamber, "I understand the pressure to move this legislation forward quickly. But I believe every member in this chamber, regardless of party, would agree that we cannot properly represent our constituents if we don't know what we're voting on." She paused, looking directly at Johnson. "This isn't about partisan advantage. It's about the basic integrity of our legislative process." The moment hung in the air, a direct appeal to democratic principles that transcended the immediate political conflict. Johnson, a constitutional lawyer before entering politics, visibly struggled with the tension between his parliamentary strategy and the fundamental values he had built his career defending. In the gallery, journalists had stopped typing, waiting to see how Johnson would respond. Members on both sides of the aisle leaned forward, sensing the historic weight of the moment. Many had privately complained about similar, last-minute changes in previous bills but had never seen them challenged, so effectively on the House floor, 3 junior members of Johnson's own party exchanged meaningful glances. They had expressed concerns in the closed caucus meeting about not having enough time to review the final text, but had been assured by leadership that the changes were minor technical corrections. Now they found themselves witnessing evidence to the contrary in front of C-SPAN cameras and a packed gallery. A veteran representative, who had served through 6 different speakers, whispered to his seatmate, "In 30 years, I've never seen someone corner a speaker like this, with facts, not theatrics." The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. "The chair recognizes the validity of ensuring all members have accurate information before voting," Johnson finally said, his tone measured but strained. "In the interest of proper procedure, we will pause consideration of this bill temporarily while the updated text is redistributed and reviewed." A murmur spread through the chamber, not the usual partisan reactions, but a collective recognition that something unexpected had just occurred. Johnson had effectively conceded Crockett's point rather than force a vote that might publicly undermine legislative transparency, but Crockett wasn't finished. With the skill of an experienced trial attorney who knows exactly when to press an advantage, she responded, "I appreciate the Speaker's commitment to transparency. To ensure this situation doesn't repeat itself, would the Speaker support forming a bipartisan working group to review our rules on bill text changes and establish clearer guidelines for last-minute amendments?" It was a masterful move, offering Johnson a constructive path forward while simultaneously cementing her victory. Refusing such a reasonable proposal after already conceding the main point would appear petty and obstructionist. The chair would welcome such a discussion through the appropriate channels, Johnson replied, professional but clearly eager to end the exchange. "Thank you." "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, "I look forward to working together to strengthen our democratic processes." As she returned to her seat, the impact of what had just occurred rippled through the chamber. What had begun as an attempt to quietly push through significant policy changes
had transformed into a public commitment to legislative transparency.
More importantly, it had happened without descending into the partisan shouting matches that typically characterize congressional confrontations. In the press gallery, reporters were already crafting headlines. "Crockett forces transparency victory," one would read. "Midnight changes exposed, speaker backs down," declared another. Within hours, clips of the exchange were spreading across social media platforms, accumulating millions of views. What made the moment particularly powerful was Crockett's approach. Rather than engaging in personal attacks or hyperbolic accusations, she had methodically presented evidence, cited specific rules, and appealed to shared democratic values. The contrast with the typical congressional theatrics was striking. Behind the scenes, the impact was even more dramatic. Johnson called an emergency meeting with his leadership team, trying to understand how the last-minute changes had been exposed and how to minimize the political damage. "She completely outmaneuvered us," one senior Republican admitted in the closed-door meeting. "We thought we were being clever with those midnight changes, but she made us look like we were hiding something from the public," another leader added. "The problem isn't just today's vote. It's that she's established herself as someone who does her homework and can't be intimidated. That's going to complicate our strategy moving forward." Johnson, despite his public composure, was furious about the situation. "Who leaked the earlier version of the bill?" he demanded. "And who sent those emails she mentioned?" The room fell silent. No one knew for certain if the emails Crockett mentioned even existed. The possibility that she had bluffed successfully only added to the leadership's frustration. Meanwhile, in Crockett's office, her small team celebrated their strategic victory. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, anticipating that the majority would attempt to slip controversial provisions into the final bill text. The Speaker didn't expect someone to actually read every word and compare versions, one staffer remarked. "They thought they could overwhelm us with 2,700 pages, and we wouldn't notice the changes." Crockett was more measured in her response. "This isn't about embarrassing anyone," she told her team. "It's about making sure the process works the way it's supposed to. The American people deserve to know what their government is doing, especially when it involves billions of their tax dollars." As news of the confrontation spread, political analysts on cable news programs struggled to fit what had happened into the usual partisan narratives. "What we witnessed today wasn't typical congressional theater," observed a veteran political commentator. Representative Crockett didn't engage in personal attacks or partisan grandstanding. She simply insisted on following the rules and backed it up with meticulous preparation. It's refreshing, but it also suggests a new model for effective opposition. By evening, the political impact had expanded beyond the immediate procedural victory. 3 moderate Republicans who had been wavering on the bill announced they would not support it without time to review the changes, effectively preventing its passage before the funding deadline. This development forced Johnson back to the negotiating table, where several of the most controversial midnight changes were ultimately removed to secure the needed votes. More significantly, the episode highlighted Crockett's unique approach to congressional confrontation. In an era when political disagreements typically devolved into personal attacks and partisan talking points, she had demonstrated the effectiveness of thorough preparation, procedural knowledge, and appeals to shared democratic values. What Representative Crockett did today wasn't just win a political skirmish, noted a political science professor interviewed on Evening News. She provided a template for how substantive oversight can work in a highly polarized environment. The question now is whether others will follow her example or return to business as usual. For regular Americans watching the dramatic events unfold, Crockett's approach resonated precisely because it differed so markedly from typical political behavior. Social media comments reflected this sentiment. "Finally, someone who cares more about doing the job right than scoring partisan points. Imagine if all our representatives actually read bills before voting on them. No shouting. No personal attacks, just holding people accountable with facts. More of this, please!" As evening fell in Washington, both Johnson and Crockett prepared for the next phase of the confrontation. The debt ceiling deadline still loomed, but the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Johnson now faced pressure not just to pass a bill, but to do so with transparency and proper procedure. Crockett had established herself as someone who could not be dismissed or intimidated, a formidable voice for accountability regardless of which party held power. In her Capitol office, Crockett received calls from senior members of her party congratulating her on the day's events. But she remained focused on the substance rather than the political victory. Today wasn't about winning a news cycle, she told a colleague. It was about making sure our legislative process serves the American people, not special interests. The real test will be whether this leads to lasting changes in how we operate. As the story dominated evening news broadcasts, the American public had witnessed something rare in modern politics, a confrontation where substance triumphed over spectacle, and where democratic principles prevailed over partisan advantage. The question now was whether this moment would become a turning point or merely an exception to business as usual in Washington. The repercussions of the Crockett-Johnson confrontation extended far beyond that single legislative day, reshaping power dynamics in Congress and altering how Americans viewed their legislative process. Within 48 hours, what began as a procedural objection had evolved into a national conversation about transparency in government. Major newspapers published detailed analyses of the midnight changes Crockett had exposed. The Washington Post revealed that one removed provision would have required cryptocurrency companies to disclose their environmental impact, a requirement that would have affected major donors to several key committee chairs. The New York Times identified language, buried in the final pages that would have shielded three specific chemical manufacturers from cleanup liability at designated Superfund sites. These revelations transformed what might have been a one-day story about parliamentary maneuvering into a sustained examination of how legislation actually gets made. Cable news programs that typically focused on personality conflicts found themselves explaining procedural rules and the importance of bill text transparency, a shift that ratings showed actually resonated with viewers. For Johnson, the political fallout was complicated. His core supporters initially rallied around him, portraying Crockett's actions as obstructionist tactics that endangered important legislation. But as more details emerged about the specific changes that had been made without proper notification, this narrative became increasingly difficult to maintain. 3 days after the confrontation, the speaker faced uncomfortable questions from his own caucus members in a closed-door meeting. "How are we supposed to defend this process to our constituents?" asked one representative from a competitive district. "I spent yesterday's town hall trying to explain why we tried to pass changes no one had read, and I had no good answer." Another member was more direct. "We're supposed to be the party that stands for transparency and following the rules." This made us look like hypocrites. The leadership team quickly developed a strategy to contain the damage. They announced a procedural reform initiative that largely incorporated the transparency measures Crockett had proposed, an implicit acknowledgement that her position had been correct. Johnson publicly described this as building on existing commitments to open government, but privately, his team recognized it as necessary damage control. For Crockett, the aftermath brought a different kind of challenge: sudden national prominence. Her office received over 15,000 messages in the first week after the confrontation, and requests for media appearances poured in from across the country. Major publications requested profiles, and Sunday morning political shows competed for her first extended interview. The sudden spotlight revealed another aspect of Crockett's character that resonated with the public. Despite numerous opportunities to capitalize on her newfound fame, she consistently redirected attention to the substance of her concerns rather than personal advancement. When a major network offered her a primetime special focused on her personal story and rise to prominence, she counter-proposed a town hall format discussing legislative transparency and citizen oversight instead. "Representative Crockett understands something fundamental about political power," observed a veteran political strategist. "True influence comes not just from moments of confrontation, but from how you handle the aftermath." By maintaining her focus on principles rather than personality, she's building something more lasting than a viral moment. Even members of Johnson's party privately acknowledged the effectiveness of her approach. "She's not giving us anything to attack," one Republican strategist complained to colleagues. We can't paint her as an attention seeker when she keeps turning down profiles to talk about process reform. It's frustratingly smart politics. The business community also took notice. Corporate government relations teams began conducting more thorough analyses of legislation, concerned about the reputational risks of being associated with secretive provisions. One prominent lobbying firm circulated an internal memo advising clients that the Crockett standard of legislative scrutiny meant potentially greater exposure for last-minute favorable provisions, rather than leveraging this attention for personal political gain. Crockett maintained her focus on the substantive issues. When she did appear on a national Sunday show, she spent most of the interview discussing the importance of legislative transparency rather than criticizing Johnson or his party. "This isn't about personalities or parties," she explained. "It's about whether our legislative process serves the American people or special interests. Every American, regardless of political affiliation, deserves representatives who actually know what they're voting on." This approach, focusing on democratic principles rather than partisan advantage, resonated across political lines. A poll conducted 2 weeks after the confrontation showed 78% of Americans supported stricter rules about last-minute changes to legislation, including 71% of Republicans and 84% of Democrats. Within Congress, Crockett's effectiveness created a ripple effect among her colleagues. Senior members of her party, some of whom had initially viewed her as too uncompromising, now sought her input on strategic matters. Junior members studied her approach, recognizing that thorough preparation and procedural knowledge could be more effective than performative. Outrage. What representative Crockett demonstrated is that you can be both principled and effective. Noted a veteran congressional observer, she didn't compromise her values, but she also didn't engage in the kind of theatrical confrontation that makes for good clips but rarely changes outcomes. The legislative impact was equally significant. The revised debt ceiling bill that eventually passed contained none of the controversial midnight changes Crockett had exposed. More importantly, both parties agreed to new House rules requiring all substantive changes made after committee approval to be clearly identified and shared with all members at least 24 hours before floor votes, a direct result of the issues Crockett had raised. Beyond Washington, the confrontation catalyzed increased public interest in legislative transparency. Civic education organizations reported surges in traffic to their websites explaining how bills become laws. Local news stations began examining whether their state legislatures had similar transparency issues. College government departments incorporated videos of the exchange into their courses on legislative process. What's remarkable is how this technical, procedural confrontation has engaged everyday Americans, observed a political science professor at Georgetown University. Representative Crockett made legislative transparency interesting and relevant to people who normally tune out these process stories. 6 months after the confrontation, its influence continued to reshape congressional operations. Staff members on both sides reported more careful attention to procedural details, knowing that the kind of oversight Crockett had demonstrated could expose shortcuts. Lobbyists complained privately that it had become more difficult to insert client-friendly provisions at the last minute, as committee staff now scrutinized late changes more carefully. Perhaps the most telling indicator came nearly a year later, when Crockett and Johnson found themselves working together on a bipartisan election security bill. During a meeting to resolve differences between House and Senate versions, Johnson acknowledged the impact of their previous confrontation. "I didn't appreciate it at the time," he admitted, "but your insistence on proper procedure actually made for better legislation. When everyone knows what they're voting on, we get better outcomes, even if it sometimes makes leadership's job more difficult." Crockett's response reflected her consistent focus on substance over politics. "I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, we're all here to serve the American people, not our parties or special interests." This exchange, reported by staff present at the meeting, symbolized something rare in modern politics: how a principled confrontation, handled with professionalism rather than personal attacks, could lead to improved governance rather than deeper division. For political communications experts, the Crockett-Johnson confrontation became a case study in effective oversight. "Notice what she didn't do," explained one consultant in a widely shared analysis. "She didn't call names. make accusations about motives, or try to create viral moments for social media. She simply came extraordinarily prepared, knew the rules better than her opponents, and focused on substance rather than spectacle. Media training companies incorporated video of the confrontation into their curriculum, using it to demonstrate how preparation and focus on democratic principles could be more effective than outrage and accusations. This approach requires more work, one trainer acknowledged, but it also produces more substantive results and builds credibility across party lines. As another budget season approached, with its inevitable confrontations and deadline pressures, legislators and staff on both sides found themselves operating in a changed environment. Last-minute changes still occurred, but they were now explicitly identified and communicated. A small but significant improvement in legislative transparency. For everyday Americans, many of whom had grown cynical about congressional procedures, the episode offered a rare glimpse of how oversight was supposed to work in a democratic system. It demonstrated that despite partisan polarization, there remained space for principled confrontation that produced substantive improvements rather than just political theater. What we witnessed wasn't just a political victory for Representative Crockett, concluded a respected congressional historian. It was a victory for the legislative process itself, a reminder that rules and procedures aren't just technicalities, but essential safeguards that protect democratic governance from being captured by special interests. As clips of the confrontation continued, to be used in civics classes and government courses across the country, Crockett's approach served as a powerful counterexample to the cynical view that all political confrontation was merely performance. She had demonstrated that preparation, procedural knowledge, and commitment to democratic principles could be not just morally right, but strategically effective. In an era when Americans had grown accustomed to political confrontations that generated heat without light, the Crockett-Johnson exchange offered something different, a model of how democratic oversight could work when focused on substance rather than spectacle. It wasn't just a moment of political triumph for one representative, but a reminder of how the system was meant to function when those within it put democratic principles ahead of partisan advantage. If you found this breakdown of this historic confrontation illuminating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses of the moments that are reshaping American political media. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our coverage of these pivotal exchanges that reveal the true character of public servants and the functioning of our democracy. This is how real accountability works, not through shouting matches, but through prepared, principled oversight that puts the American people's interests first. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.